Dersu's Vanishing World. On the eve of World War I, 1914, the Russian Empire stretched from Europe to the Pacific, encompassing a huge amount of the globe. And the railroad was supposed to bridge the east and the west of Russia. So when the revolution of 1917 overthrows autocracy, that's the February Revolution of 1917, and then there will be the October Revolution of 1917 when the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government, and then comes the Civil War. So very complicated and hard to do much in terms of detail in this short YouTube, but the revolution was very much something that takes part within the context of World War I and the troubles that the Russian government was having and the lack of confidence of people with the war. And the revolution begins in St. Petersburg or Petrograd, and that's very much sort of the center, the West. A.J. Hayward, I think, sums up the sort of center aspect of the revolution, the February Revolution of 1917, with the quote, "When the February Revolution of 1917 in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, brought down Russia's monarchy, the governors of Siberia tried to hush up the news." It's impossible to hush up the news, in part because the railroad makes hushing it up an exercise in futility. So again, the role of the railroad will continue to be vital in all of this. The Eastern response to 1917 and the overthrow of Romanov rule was pretty much enthusiastic. It was met with overall enthusiasm. We've looked at the poor working conditions that many of the workers faced, particularly in terms of mining and logging, and that these workers felt mistreated, and they were angry, and so these workers were very enthusiastic in the idea of changes and hoping that there'll be change for the better. There were many exiles. Remember, by the Revolution of 1905, it led to another onslaught of exiles heading east. So there's plenty of revolutionaries with a great deal of experience in the East, and they're eager to use it. They are eager to form local committees to discuss revolutionary blueprints, and many of them are also heading back to the center, heading back to the West, to be part of the revolution in the center. The role of World War I directly on the East was very limited because it was also very much something that was taking part in the West and in the center. So initially the revolution in the East did not necessarily amount to much. The local authorities changed their job titles, and some of the local authorities were thrown out, but not a lot changed. There were plenty of special committees established, and many of these special committees met and just talked a great deal, and there's a lot of discussion that goes on in revolutions. And one of the big issues of the day was the question of Siberian autonomy, of what would be the role of Siberia. Would it be able to become an autonomous, separate entity? The Civil War brings the center to the periphery via the railroad, and it's really during the period of the Civil War after the October Revolution of 1917, which is the revolution where the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government and begin to rule in the name of Soviet power, that the periphery is drawn in to events. John Stefanov sums up the revolution before the Civil War with this wonderful quip, 10 days that shook the world, only ruffled the Far East. And he's alluding to the very famous work by John Reed of 10 Days That Shook the World. The day after the revolution, or holding on to power, is the real test of any revolution. And this is very important for Lenin, who leads the Bolsheviks, in terms of being able to win over the public. And one of his promises was to give land, one was to give peace, and the other was to give all power to the Soviets. So by declaring Soviet power, he can make good on the idea of all power to the Soviets. He declares a decree on peace, along with a decree on land, the day after the revolution, or the coup, as some people call it, took place. And what Lenin calls for is a general peace, that everybody just stops fighting in World War I, and this doesn't work. people don't stop fighting. So it becomes sort of a thorny issue. If Lenin has promised peace, how's he going to get it? And Trotsky, who is the architect for the Red Army, he calls for no war, no peace, which doesn't really make any sense. Bukharin, another important Bolshevik, says, well, let's continue the war and call it a revolutionary war. And Lenin nixes that idea and says, no, we need peace. And Lenin insists on peace to provide what he calls a necessary breathing space. And so Lenin sort of muscles the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. And here is a wonderful image of the Germans meeting the Soviet delegates to determine the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And there is the train in the background, always the train. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk terms were very, very harsh, and there were many Russians that were very upset with making this separate peace with Germany, and the Germans were very punitive in their peace terms. Another group that was very unhappy with this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk were some 40,000 Czech and Slovak soldiers who had been fighting along the Russian front against Austro-Hungary, and when the separate peace is devised, they insist on being able to somehow make it back to continue to fight on the Western Front. And so this Czech Legion, as it's sometimes called, travels along the Great Siberian Railroad in some 65 trains to Vladivostok to get to the Western Front to continue to fight in World War I. Along with the Imperial Gold Reserve is on this train, which will ultimately be lost somewhere along the way. And I love this image here of the armored train too. Isn't that a great looking train? Well, the story goes that as the Czech Legion was traveling east, a Hungarian POW was insulted by a Czech soldier on a Siberian train platform. A scuffle ensued. The Czech soldier was killed. The Hungarian was lynched, and the Czechs seized the station, and this sort of kicks off the Russian Civil War. There's more to it than that, but it's a great story. So the Siberian Front is very, very messy, and when Leon Trotsky, who is the Commissar of War and the creator of the Red Army, gets word of what's going on, he sends a message that the Czech Legion needs to be disarmed, which the Czech Legion completely ignores, and the white forces, the anti-Bolsheviks, intercept this message and begin to use it for its own benefit to fight against the Bolsheviks. The Civil War in Russia is marked by what is sometimes referred to the train fronts, that the main action often takes place in train depots or train stations or around train tracks, and that it's a war fought around the train. And by June 8, 1918, all cities on the Trans-Siberian Railroad from the Volga to Omsk are in Czech hands. So essentially, Siberia is in the hands of anti-Bolshevik forces. But as we've seen in Beck, these towns change hands repeatedly, and the whites end up looking worse than the reds. And although there's maybe not a great deal of support for any of these armies and a pox on both houses, there's terror on all sides, that the Reds ultimately look a little better. And who controls the train station controls the area. And I have a couple of maps you can look at more fully. You can pause and look and see how the Bolshevik forces controlled the center area and the periphery is controlled by the anti-Bolshevik forces. And this is seen as one of the key reasons why the Bolsheviks win and the anti-Bolshevik forces, or the white forces, lose. And there's other reasons too. And as you can see, then there's these arrows in the east of the Kolchak movement, and we'll be looking at Admiral Kolchak and his whitest army next. Admiral Alexander Kolchak is just one of the white generals, but a very famous white general. There's a film called Admiral about him if you're interested in watching a Russian film. And Kolchak, ardent anti-Bolshevik, establishes a government in the east, in Omsk, and rules as a dictator of what he calls the Provisional All-Russian Government. And he is called the supreme ruler and commander-in-chief of all Russian land and sea forces. But in reality, his government is weak, it's ineffective, and it's ruthless. And the Siberians don't really care much for Kolchak, in part because he's not from there and he just doesn't have a real good understanding or good read of what the Siberian interests are. He doesn't understand the pulse of Siberia. He doesn't favor autonomy, very dismissive of this idea, and this is a big idea for Siberians. And he forces peasants to serve underneath him, and they are resistant to that. So in the east, the civil war between the Reds and the Whites, and there's also Greens and Blacks, and it's very confusing. Overall, the Bolsheviks lack support, but the Bolsheviks gain from the disorganization of their opponents. The social revolutionaries, as I've mentioned previously, were the most popular revolutionary political group, but the Bolsheviks have the Red Army, and that's going to count for a lot. So the Red Army moves east, and as it moves east, it dislodges its anti-Bolshevik opponents. So the White Army ultimately has to retreat through Siberia, what is known as the Great Siberian Ice March, where thousands die. Kolchak ultimately executed in Irkutsk, and that's getting close to the end of the Whites trying to put up a fight against the Reds. There are other more local dictators in Siberia, and Beck's memoir talks about them. Semyonov is one such dictator, another anti-Bolshevik, who sets up headquarters in Chita, and he refused to recognize Kolchak. So there's a lot of disunity within the white movement, and this again helps the Bolsheviks to beat the anti-Bolsheviks because of this lack of unity and because of the alienation of the peasants and the lack of a plan or a vision for the anti-Bolshevik forces. And so the Soviet power wins out, wins the Civil War. And one of the consequences, as we will see, is this is then when the center really begins to play an important role on the periphery, particularly in terms of Stalinization. And then Stalinization will have profound consequences on the East, as we will see in the next couple of weeks. But the early years of Soviet power was marked by regionalism, and there was really no central control in the East, and just a series of short-lived governments as the new Bolshevik government was trying to figure things out in the center. Another issue was foreign intervention on the periphery. So yes, the Czech Legion did make it to Vladivostok, but it was not only the Czech Legion, it was also the Americans, it was also the Japanese. It was a lot of foreign intervention, and overall, the foreign intervention was a bad idea, and most historians argue it did not help the anti-Bolshevik white cause in the least. John Stefan says that U.S. policy promoted this image of a beleaguered Czechs valiantly striving to free themselves from the evils of Kaiser Bolshevik collusion in the depth of Siberia. And Vladivostok then became a kaleidoscopic array of military forces with a total of 11 foreign expeditionary forces showing up in Vladivostok. You can imagine what a mess this is. And I love this picture of American troops marching in Vladivostok with Japanese Marines watching them as they parade along the buildings occupied by the Czech Legion. Pretty crazy, huh? The Japanese troops also tried to use this opportunity, that's such a mess, to make further inroads into an area that has interested them a long time. We'll look at this more fully in the next couple of weeks. But the Japanese stay longer than anybody else in the Russian Far East and try to really set up shop. Ultimately, the choices to be made are, you could argue, all bad choices. What flavor of dictatorship will the Russian people choose? Do they choose a dictatorship from the right or a dictatorship from the left? And ultimately the Bolsheviks win out, and the Bolsheviks then are able to establish Soviet power. Your discussion for this week looks at Dersu's Vanishing World. And here's a wonderful image of Arseniev and Dersu Rizala. And as you look at this wonderful work, Dersu the Trapper, you might want to again refer back to this slide. We looked at this previously when we looked at the indigenous peoples of the East. And think about the whole question of Dersu and contact with the West, the role of imperialism, the role of nature, the role of making sense of the world, and we will return to this next week.